Segment 1, Alulim, the first king who walked out of the dawn. Before there were cities, before the first reeds were cut for writing, before barley bent in the wind of cultivated fields, there was a story Sumerians told in hushed tones around firelights and temple courtyards, a story pressed into clay long after even its tellers had turned to dust. They said kingship descended from the heavens, not as a metaphor, not as poetry, but as a literal shaping of the world. And when it descended, it chose one man to be its vessel. That man was Alulim. No one pretended to remember his face. No carvings survive, no inscriptions, no royal seals. What remains is only the idea of him, an axis around which human order first spun. The King List gives him a reign so vast it folds the imagination. 28,800 years. A number that behaves more like a symbol than a statistic, a way of saying his rule was not like ours. To the Sumerians, Alulim was not simply a man. He was the moment that chaos learned direction, that wandering gave way to settlement, that human hands first traced a line in the soil and called it the boundary of a city. His home was Eridu, a quiet settlement near the marshlands, the place they believed the world itself began. If you stood there in that time, whatever time means in a mythic age, you would not see a palace or an army. You would see a cluster of reed huts, a rising temple mound, and a man whose authority was not measured in walls or weapons, but in a growing conviction among his people that the world could be organized. Alulim's leadership was described not in victories, but in firsts. The first laws spoken aloud rather than implied. The first offerings given to a centralized shrine. The first shaping of communal labor. The first idea that the ruler stood between gods and men, translating cosmic order into earthly stability. What mattered was not what he built, but what he proved possible. Civilization begins at the moment someone believes it can. Sumerian scribes wrote his name thousands of years later, preserving him as the mythical starting point. The hinge where silence turns into story, where wandering humans become citizens of something larger than themselves. In the cadence of the King List, every ruler that follows, mortal or divine, gentle or violent, walks in the faint shadow of Alulim. He is less a character than a threshold, the first ripple in a long series of echoes that become history. And so, the story begins here, with a king who may have never lived as a man, but who lives eternally as a beginning. Segment 2, Alulim, the king who learned to hold the waters. After the world had learned it could be shaped, it had to learn how to endure. If Alulim was the first spark of order, then Alulim was its careful keeper. The King List tells us he ruled after Alulim, inheriting not chaos, but something far more fragile, a newly organized world that could still fall apart. Like his predecessor, Alulim's reign is given an impossible length, 36,000 years, yet the number itself tells us less about time than about continuity. To the Sumerians, Alulim ruled not through conquest or glory, but through maintenance. Civilization, they understood, does not collapse in a single moment. It erodes when attention fades. The land around Eridu was alive but dangerous. Marshes fed the people, but rivers could destroy them. Floodwaters arrived without warning, swallowing homes and fields, erasing weeks of labor in a single night. Survival demanded not just leadership, but coordination on a scale humans had never attempted before. Alulim's story lives in this quiet struggle. Where Alulim established order, Alulim preserved it through management, of labor, of water, of seasonal rhythms. The people of the city would have known his name, not because of monuments, but because of channels dug and maintained, levees reinforced year after year, and shared rules about when to plant and when to wait. In later generations, scribes described him almost as an engineer of the early world, not a builder of towers, but a ruler who learned something essential, that nature does not need to be defeated, only guided carefully enough to remain predictable. His reign stands as an early expression of a truth every civilization eventually confronts. The greatest threat is rarely invasion. It is neglect. The mythic length of Alalungar's rule suggests he was remembered not as a man who lived long, but as a pattern that held steady. Year after year, flood season after flood season, a king whose legacy was continuity itself. And in the slow Sumerian telling, he becomes something larger than a ruler. He becomes the symbol of collective discipline, the moment when humanity learned that survival depended not on heroes, but on shared responsibility. By the time his name fades from the list, the world is no longer raw. It is settled, fragile, and waiting for the next transformation. Segment 3. Enmenlu-Ana, the king whose time broke all measures. By the time Enmenlu-Ana ruled, time itself had begun to lose its meaning. The Sumerian King List assigns him a reign of 43,200 years, a number so large it no longer describes a lifespan, but a cosmic scale. This was not an accident of exaggeration. To the Sumerians, time was not a straight line, but a layered substance, measured in cycles rather than years. And Enmenlu-Ana did not rule within time. He ruled as an expression of it. His name tells us more than the numbers ever could. En suggests lordship tied to the sacred. Ana points upward, to the sky, to the realm of the gods. He was remembered not as a conqueror of land, but as a custodian of the heavens' order reflected on earth. In this segment of myth, the world is no longer learning how to survive. It is learning how to keep pace with the cosmos. Under Enmenlu-Ana, the rhythms of the sky mattered, the movement of the sun and moon, the return of stars to familiar positions, the timing of floods and harvests. All of these became entwined with the legitimacy of kingship. A ruler who could align the city with the sky was a ruler who understood how the universe breathed. This is where kings begin to resemble priest astronomers. Temples rise not merely as places of worship, but as observatories. Shadows are tracked, stars are named, days are grouped, seasons counted, festivals aligned with celestial events. The king's authority flows not from force, but from accuracy, from his ability to ensure that rituals happen at the correct moment, that offerings are made when the gods expect them. To rule for 43,200 years in this sense is to embody an unchanging order in a changing world. Enmenlu-Ana becomes less a man and more a constant, a living calibration point against which all human activity is measured. The people would not have spoken of his age. They would have spoken of regularity, of floods that arrived when expected, of seasons that returned in balance, of a sky that made sense. But such balance carries danger. When time becomes rigid, when order hardens into certainty, the system becomes vulnerable to the unexpected. The myths do not yet speak of collapse, but they lean toward it. Because after this reign, the numbers grow stranger still, and the distance between gods and men begins to close in uneasy ways. Enmenlu-Ana stands at the edge of that tension, a king whose greatest achievement was making time intelligible, and whose legacy hints at what happens when humans believe they have finally measured the heavens. Segment 4. Enmengal-Ana, the shepherd king beneath the sky. By the age of Enmengal-Ana, kingship no longer simply reflected the heavens. It began to mediate them. Where Enmenlu-Ana brought time into alignment, Enmengal-Ana was remembered as the one who guided living things through that order. His reign, recorded as 28,800 years, bends once again into the symbolic. But the role assigned to him is deeply human. The Sumerians called him a shepherd, not a metaphor chosen lightly. In the early world, shepherds were watchers of thresholds. They stood between safety and wilderness, between hunger and abundance, between the known and the unknown. To call a king a shepherd was to declare that his task was not domination, but watchfulness. Under Enmen-Gal-Ana, the myths suggest a world that had fully settled into pattern. Cities endure, fields repeat their cycles, families assume tomorrow will resemble today, and it is precisely here that leadership becomes most demanding, because stability must be protected from slow erosion. The shepherd king watched the people as much as the land, disputes over water, the drift of herds into forbidden fields, the tension between growing populations and finite resources. This was not a time of heroics, but of constant adjustment. Above him, the sky remained the ultimate guide. Enmen-Gal-Ana's authority rested in his perceived ability to read divine intention in celestial motion, not to predict the future, but to know when to intervene and when to wait. A shepherd does not command the flock at every step. He follows its movement closely, correcting only when danger appears. The long reign attributed to him suggests a memory of extraordinary continuity, the idea that someone, or something, kept watch long enough that disaster did not arrive, that the sky remained legible, that the flood stayed within its banks. Yet, beneath the calm tone of the myth lies a warning. A shepherd king sees threats before others do, and what he sees shapes what comes next. After Enmen-Gal-Ana, the king list moves toward figures whose stories grow darker, more unstable, kings whose connection to the divine becomes less interpretive and more intrusive. Enmen-Gal-Ana stands in that quiet moment just before uncertainty returns. The last ruler remembered primarily for care rather than power. Beneath the sky, among people who trusted its rhythms, he watched, and held the world together a little longer. Segment 5. Dumuzi the Shepherd, the King Who Became a God. With Dumuzi, the story of kingship crosses a threshold it can never fully return from. He is listed among the ancient kings of Sumer, a ruler of Bad Tibira, remembered for a reign of 36,000 years. But unlike those who came before him, Dumuzi does not remain confined to the king list. He escapes it, stepping out of record and into religion, ritual, and seasonal myth. Dumuzi is remembered not only as a king, but as a dying god. In early Sumerian imagination, the shepherd was the ideal ruler. He did not seize power, he tended it. He guided flocks through scarcity and abundance. He understood loss. Dumuzi embodied this role so completely that his kingship began to overlap with something larger, a cosmic cycle that governed life itself. Myths tell us Dumuzi became the husband of Inanna, the goddess of love, fertility, and warfare. Through her, he was tied directly to the forces that caused fields to bloom and wither. When Dumuzi falls from favor and is taken to the underworld, the land itself grows barren. When he returns, life resumes. Here, kingship becomes sacrifice. Dumuzi's reign is not measured by time, but by recurrence. His rule survives not in monuments, but in annual rites of mourning and renewal. Priests and priestesses would chant laments for his descent, weeping publicly, reenacting the grief of the goddess and the suffering of the land. In this way, Dumuzi becomes the first king whose death matters more than his life. He represents the realization that civilization depends not only on order, but on loss, on accepting that abundance is temporary, that rulers fall, that cycles cannot be escaped. Kings after him rule knowing they are replaceable. Gods remain, seasons return, humans endure through repetition. Dumuzi's story suggests something profoundly ancient, that early societies understood power not as permanence, but as participation in a larger rhythm they could not control. After Dumuzi, the kings grow more anxious. The sky remains important, but the underworld enters the story. Authority begins to carry consequence. The idea of immortality shifts from reign lengths to myth. Dumuzi is not remembered as the longest reigning king or the most powerful. He is remembered as the one who left and came back changed. Segment 6. Enmengalana, the last king before the flood. Every story of beginnings eventually bends toward an ending. Enmengalana stands at that bend. His name appears late among the antediluvian kings, recorded as ruling 36,000 years, and then, without flourish, the list moves toward the flood. No triumph marks his departure. No catastrophe is described in his own time. Only a quiet sense that something has begun to fail. By the era of Enmengalana, kingship has been tested by abundance, scarcity, order, sacrifice, and myth. The sky has been measured. The land has been organized. The gods have walked closely among humans. And yet, beneath the calm structure of civilization, pressure has been building. Enmengalana rules a world that feels overly balanced, as though held together by habit rather than understanding. The people continue their rituals, the temples stand, the fields produce. But in the logic of myth, too much stability breeds fragility. If earlier kings were bridges between chaos and order, between sky and earth, then Enmengalana is remembered as the last guardian of a system that has run its course. The King List does not accuse him of failure. Instead, it positions him as a boundary marker. After his reign, kings are no longer demi-mythic caretakers of cosmic cycles. Something will erase this world and demand a new beginning. Later traditions hint at why. The gods, it is said, grow restless. Humanity multiplies. Noise fills the earth. Order hardens into arrogance. Even shepherd kings can no longer keep balance when the weight of existence becomes too heavy. Enmengalana, in this telling, becomes tragic by restraint. He does not rebel. He does not descend into mythic drama. He continues ruling as though the old rules still apply, and that may be his final mistake. The long number attached to his reign is not a sign of immortality, but of delay. A stretched moment before collapse, the calm before waters rise. After Enmengalana, the king list resets. Cities vanish. Time fractures. The flood arrives, not as punishment alone, but as a reset of meaning. Kingship itself must be reborn, and so Enmengalana remains suspended at the threshold of memory, the last king of a world that believed it had learned enough. Segment 7. Ziusudra, the king who survived the flood. When the waters finally came, they did not wash the world clean of kingship. They condensed it. Ziusudra stands apart from every ruler before him, not because he reigned longer or ruled wider, but because he endured. In the Sumerian tradition, he is the last king before the flood and the first king after it. A human hinge between annihilation and continuation. Where earlier kings bridged heaven and earth through order, Ziusudra survives through obedience and restraint. The texts speak carefully here. The gods, once generous with kingship, have grown divided. Humanity's noise has become unbearable. The old balance, shepherds, cycles, measured time, has failed. The decision is made quietly. The world will be submerged. Ziusudra is not warned because he is powerful. He is warned because he listens. In fragments that survive, the Eridu-Genesis among them, Ziusudra is instructed to build, to preserve life, to seal himself away as rain begins to fall. What follows is not heroic struggle, but long waiting. Darkness. The sound of water against wood, the unmaking of cities. When the waters recede, Ziusudra steps into a world stripped of certainty. The rivers have changed course. Temples are gone. Names mean nothing unless spoken again. Kingship, once divine and continuous, is now fragile and earned. The gods grant Ziusudra life extended beyond normal measure, not as a return to mythical reigns, but as a quiet acknowledgement. Survival itself has become sacred. In later traditions, his name will change. Utnapishtim Atrahasis, echoes that travel far beyond Sumer. But the core remains the same. He is the king who does not rule. Ziusudra governs nothing after the flood. He teaches instead what it means to remember, to rebuild without arrogance, to accept that civilizations are borrowed states, not permanent ones. After him, the king list shortens dramatically. Reigns contract into human spans. Kings become political figures rather than cosmic anchors. The distance between gods and men widens. Ziusudra marks that distance. He is the quiet end of the mythic age and the reluctant beginning of history. Segment 8. Enmebaragesi of Kish, the first king history can touch. With Enmebaragesi, something subtle but irreversible occurs. For the first time, kingship steps out of myth and leaves fingerprints behind. His name appears in the Sumerian King List like the others, but unlike the long-shadowed rulers before him, Enmebaragesi does not exist only in story. Fragments of inscriptions bearing his name have been recovered. Stone vessels, references in temple texts, traces that anchor him, not to eternity, but to the ground. He ruled the city of Kish, a place that carried immense symbolic weight. To the Sumerians, Kish represented legitimacy. When kingship descended from heaven after the flood, it descended there first. To rule from Kish was to rule with recognized authority, even if power was modest. Enmebaragesi's reign length, reduced to a human scale, signals a new age. Time no longer stretches toward the cosmic. It settles into something recordable, measurable, mortal. And with that shift comes a change in what power looks like. His inscriptions speak less of gods and more of conflict, border tensions, rival city-states, the defense of territory rather than the maintenance of cosmic balance. Kingship now concerns walls, weapons, labor, and allegiance. The divine has not disappeared, but it has retreated upward, consulted rather than embodied. This is history's defining trade. Enmebaragesi is remembered as a warrior king, one who confronted the neighboring city of Elam and asserted Kish's influence beyond its immediate fields. His authority is proven not through ritual alignment, but through survival in a crowded political world. Yet even here, echoes of the old order remain. He is still listed among kings chosen by the gods. His victories are still framed as divinely sanctioned. Civilization does not abandon myth. It thins it, stretching it over practical concerns. What makes Enmebaragesi so important is not grandeur, but certainty. He tells us that the king list is not fantasy alone, that beneath the impossible reigns and divine figures lies a real lineage of human rulers struggling with the same problems that will define politics forever. He is the first king we can touch across time, and once touched, kingship will never again be able to claim eternity. Segment 9. Gilgamesh of Uruk, the king who refused to die. With Gilgamesh, kingship stops looking upward and begins looking inward. He ruled Uruk, a city remembered not only for its walls, but for the story it told about itself. Unlike the silent names before him, Gilgamesh speaks, through clay tablets, fragmented verses, and a voice that still feels uncomfortably modern. The Sumerian King List calls him divine by fractions, 2/3 God, 1/3 man. That imbalance defines everything that follows. He is powerful enough to dominate, human enough to suffer, and restless enough to ask a question no king before him dared to shape so clearly. What happens when I die? At first, Gilgamesh is not a hero. He is tyrannical, excessive, unbearable. The people of Uruk cry out under his weight. Kingship here is no longer gentle shepherding. It is raw force paired with fragile ego. The gods intervene not to elevate him, but to temper him, creating Enkidu as a counterweight. And it is loss that transforms him. When Enkidu dies, the old contract between gods and kings collapses. Gilgamesh realizes that strength does not protect against endings. Walls decay. Bodies fail. Names fade. He sets out not to conquer, but to escape mortality itself. His journey takes him beyond city-states and politics, past monsters and thresholds, toward the one man who survived the flood. Utnapishtim, Ziusudra under a different name. The story folds in on itself. The mythic age confronts the historical one, and the answer Gilgamesh receives is devastating in its simplicity. There is no immortality for kings. The plant of life is stolen. The secret is withheld. What remains is the city, the walls of Uruk, the act of building something that may outlast the builder. Gilgamesh returns changed. He rules still, but with an understanding carved by grief. His immortality is not divine. It is narrative. He becomes eternal because his story captures the moment humanity acknowledged its limits. Gilgamesh is the first king who fails publicly and survives that failure. In him, kingship becomes psychological. Authority is no longer justified by the heavens alone, but by wisdom earned through suffering. The age of gods walking among men has ended. The age of stories about men has begun. Segment 10. Inshakushana of Uruk, the first builder of power beyond one city. After Gilgamesh, kings no longer chase eternity. They chase reach. Inshakushana of Uruk emerges in a world that has accepted limits. Gods no longer walk the streets. Flood myths live in memory. Reign lengths are short. What matters now is not how long a king rules, but how far his influence extends while he does. Inshakushana is remembered as one of the earliest kings to successfully project power beyond his own city in a systematic way. He did not merely defend Uruk. He organized dominance, binding multiple city-states through force, tribute, and ritual legitimacy. His inscriptions are striking for their tone. They are no longer mythic. They are declarative. He claims victories. He lists cities brought under control. He names gifts presented to temples not as offerings for balance, but as proof of authority. Kingship has evolved into something recognizably political. Yet, the old ideas linger. Inshakushana still frames his rule as divinely favored. The gods are consulted. Temples remain central. But divinity now operates as validation rather than participation. The king acts. The gods approve. This shift marks a dangerous competence. For the first time, power can scale. Armies move. Resources consolidate. Allegiance becomes transferable. The idea of a single city as the center of the universe fades. In its place rises a new concept: territory. Inshakushana's reign feels transitional because it exposes the logic that will define empires. Kings are no longer shepherds or cosmic stewards. They are managers of people and land who understand that permanence comes from systems, not myth. Yet this expansion carries tension. Conquered cities must be maintained. Authority must be demonstrated repeatedly. Victory does not end instability. It multiplies it. The more Inshakushana connects cities, the more fragile the network becomes. Still, in the King List and early inscriptions, he is remembered as successful. Not beloved, not divine, but effective. Inshakushana teaches future rulers a critical lesson. Power does not need eternity. It needs infrastructure. What comes next will push that lesson to its extreme. Segment 11. Sargon of Akkad, the first empire builder. With Sargon of Akkad, kingship stops pretending it is local. Before him, power spread carefully, from city to city, shrine to shrine, alliance to alliance. After him, power moves outward without apology. The ancient world becomes something new, an empire. Sargon's origins are deliberately humble, almost mythic in reverse. The stories describe him as a child set adrift in a basket on the river, rescued not by royalty, but by chance. Whether true or crafted, the message is clear. His authority does not descend from heaven. It rises from the ground. This inversion changes everything. Sargon conquers Sumerian city-states one by one. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, not to rule them as separate traditions, but to bind them under a single command. For the first time, a king governs peoples who do not share one city, one god, or one story. Where earlier rulers moved within myth, Sargon moves within logistics, roads, garrisons, standardized administration, appointed governors. Tribute flows predictably. Authority no longer depends on ritual memory but on presence. Yet Sargon does not abandon the divine. He frames his conquests as chosen by the goddess Inanna. Temples flourish under his rule. Gods are unified as much as cities. Myth becomes a tool rather than a foundation. The empire inherits religion, but does not kneel before it. What makes Sargon revolutionary is not violence alone. Warfare existed before. What he creates is continuity across distance, a state that can survive his absence, if only briefly. The King List remembers him not for impossible years, but for unprecedented scale. His reign feels shockingly modern. Decisions ripple far beyond personal sight. Loyalty becomes abstract. Resistance becomes inevitable. Sargon's empire introduces a truth kings will never forget. The bigger the structure, the more fragile its edges. By building the first empire, he ensures there will be rebellions, border tensions, and succession crises. The king is no longer a caretaker. He is the center of gravity. From this point forward, kingship cannot return to innocence. Segment 12, Naram-Sin, the king who made himself a god. If Sargon created the empire, Naram-Sin dared to redefine the heavens. A grandson of Sargon, Naram-Sin inherits not a fragile experiment, but a sprawling imperial machine. Roads exist. Armies mobilize on command. Tribute flows. The empire does not merely function, it expects obedience. And Naram-Sin demands more. Where earlier kings claimed divine favor, Naram-Sin makes a radical declaration. He is a god. His inscriptions no longer speak of service to the divine. They speak of elevation. He adopts the divine determinative before his name. He wears the horned helmet, an unmistakable symbol of godhood. This is not metaphor, it is policy. In relief carvings, Naram-Sin is shown towering above enemies, ascending mountains toward the stars, his gaze lifted not in worship, but in assertion. The old hierarchy collapses. Kings no longer stand between gods and men. Naram-Sin places himself within the divine order. For a time, it works. His empire expands further than his grandfather's. Rebellions are crushed. Borders stretch outward. Authority hardens into spectacle. Power is not explained. It is displayed. Myth, once a foundation, now becomes decoration for dominance. But the consequences arrive quietly, and then all at once. Cities rebel not just politically, but spiritually. To oppose Naram-Sin is to oppose a god, and that raises the stakes beyond compromise. When environmental stress, rebellion, and invasion converge, the empire falters under its own theological weight. Later generations will remember this moment as the curse of Akkad, a cautionary tale disguised as divine judgment. Whether ecological collapse or political overreach, the lesson becomes mythologized. A king who becomes a god invites catastrophe. Naram-Sin marks the farthest reach of early kingship. After him, rulers will claim divine right, but rarely divinity itself. The experiment has been run, and it fails violently. Looking back from history, his reign feels like an ending. The long arc that began with Alulim's quiet order, shepherding, balance, survival, culminates here, in absolute authority, fused with cosmic ambition. From gods descending to earth, to a man declaring himself divine, the story of Sumerian kings is complete.